The earlier you can be generous with someone, it impacts their life much more. Giving them an inheritance at 60 or 70 when you die at 90 is not as helpful as buying someone's house or helping them put it down a good down payment for their first house when they're 25 years old or when they're 40 years old doing an epic vacation for the family or something like that. So there's a balance here. It's very personal. Each family is going to have to figure out exactly what they want to do. But if you want to help out, I think the 529 college savings plan that isn't just for college is a great potential mechanism for you to at least consider.
Welcome to the Military Money Manual Podcast, where every episode is all about achieving financial independence in the military faster than before. We believe personal finance shouldn't be boring or intimidating. Building wealth can be simple, and financial freedom is the ultimate financial goal. Now, here's your hosts, Spencer and Jamie.
Today on the Military Money Manual Podcast, we're going to be talking about 529 college savings plans. Now, Jamie, I'm a little skeptical about the flexibility of these plans. I'm going to kind of take the skeptic's approach to this. When we were talking about this earlier, setting up for this episode, you were making a lot of great arguments in favor of the 529 plan. I have a lot of questions, and I'll admit I'm not an expert. Unlike a lot of the topics we talk about on this podcast, I don't really consider myself an expert on the 529 plan. And I don't know if you do, but I'm really just approaching this episode as with a beginner's mindset, and I'm trying to learn. Maybe you'll finally make that one point that kind of convinces me to superfund a 529 plan, but that's a straw man argument. I don't think you're arguing that we should superfund 529 plans. But yeah, this came from a listener question on Instagram. If you want to reach out at Military Money Manual on Instagram, we get lots of great listener questions on there. We don't get to all of them, but we've responded to probably 100% of them, at least.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, Jamie, let's start. Background. What's a 529 plan?
So a 529 plan is a method of having tax advantage savings for qualified education expenses. They can be state sponsored. They're not always. If you live in a certain state where you pay state taxes, in some cases, you can get a state tax deduction for it. And it's not tied to that state. So even if you save in the Utah plan or the Florida plan, that doesn't mean your kid has to go to college in Florida. It's also changed a lot recently. So I think there's a lot of misnomers about some of the flexibility. And I will say, Spencer, that this, in response to that Instagram question, we had some debate over text, and then you wouldn't stop. And I'm trying to go to bed. And I'm like, dude, I got to go to bed. Let's stop. Let's make it a podcast episode. But the real debate here, and as I have 3 529 plans, one for each of my kids, I still have questions about it. And I still have questions about how to use them the most efficiently, perfectly optimized, because if I'm not perfectly optimized, I'm a complete failure, as you know, that mindset trap that I often fall into. and it is kind of confusing. And with the rule change, there's still, I think, some misinformation. But one of the main points I want to say is that the only way you really lose at this game is by not saving at all. And whether you choose 529 or another savings method, having a plan for your kids' college or for your retirement is more important than which state you choose, finding the perfect expense ratio, the perfect investment option. You need to have a plan, and that will be a win.
Yeah, because, let's be honest, Jamie, if you are the kind of person who can set aside $250,000 in a 529 plan or in a taxable brokerage account or in an FDIC-insured certificate of deposit or savings account for your child's education, like a child who's approaching university in 2025, 2030, 2040, 2050 with $250,000 saved, that's a great position to be in. Like whether you did it exactly right in the most tax efficient way is almost moot at that point, because you have the cash there to achieve the goal that you set, the objective that you set, which is to either send your child or your nephew, your niece, or some other family member. We'll get into the specifics of that. But the overarching point is if you save for college, whether it's in a 529 taxable brokerage, just a savings account, which I think most of us would say probably not a savings account, especially if you have a long runway, like you've just had a child and you have 18 years to save for them, then any type of account is going to be better than nothing. But let's talk about the basic mechanics of the 529 plan. So it's after tax contribution. So this isn't like a traditional IRA or traditional 401k where you get to skip paying taxes now. You can only make contributions with money that you've already paid taxes on. So that's your basic W-2 income. You would just take an allotment from your MyPay, from your paycheck, and you would move it over to your 529 account, which can be at any of the classic account holders. Vanguard is one in particular. Then the money grows tax-free. So that's an interesting benefit right there of the account is, let's say you have it in a bond fund that's throwing off 5% dividends every year. You're not adding those dividends to your taxable income for that year. That's a great advantage right there. And then the money gets to be withdrawn tax-free for qualified expenses. So rather than like if you had a taxable brokerage account and you were selling appreciated shares of stock or of VTI out of there, you'd have to pay capital gains tax on that if you were coming out of a taxable brokerage account to pay for college. But if you're pulling the money out of a 529 plan, then you don't have to pay capital gains tax on that money.
Hey, 2 points to clarify there. It doesn't have to be an allotment. You can set up a direct deposit from your pay, or you can just direct deposit, automatic transfer from your account each month. And you have lots of options between like a Vanguard one. I use Vanguard one, plenty of state options. I've had, I think, Indiana and Nevada in the past, and you can look back at like the track record of that state's offerings over the last 10 years and how good they are. In general, 529s are going to be higher fees than most of the other ones. So the state doesn't really matter unless you're paying state taxes. And so when Spencer, you're talking about after-tax contributions, the only other caveat I'd add there is if you are paying state taxes, some states do have a tax deduction for the money. It might not be a one-for-one swap. Each state does it a little differently if they give a deduction at all. So that's definitely something to look at if you're in a state like maybe New York or California where you're paying state taxes for some reason while you're on active duty.
Yeah, and like you said, there have been some recent changes. So you can now withdraw up to $10,000 annually to pay for kindergarten, 12th grade tuition. You can pull money out for apprenticeship programs. They now count student loan repayments, buying computer equipment and internet access for the student. And then I think the really big one that a lot of people got excited about is you're allowed to roll over $35,000 of the account of the 529 plan to a Roth IRA. But one big caveat on that is you can't do it all at once. It's up to the contribution limit for that year. So in 2025, you could do $7,000 of contributions to the Roth IRA from the 529. And so that could be a good way to get money out of a 529 plan, but you have to do it year by year, essentially. So for $35,000, it's going to take you 5 years to pull all the money out of your 529 and then put it into a Roth IRA. And you also need earned income as well. So you have to be able to legally contribute to a Roth IRA. It's almost like if you were going to make the contribution to a Roth IRA anyways, that's great. If you have leftover money in a 529, okay. But again, I guess this is one of my first sticking points with this plan is, yes, you have this escape valve through a Roth IRA, but it's not as good as it initially seems. Like it's not like you can just roll over $35,000 in one single year. You have to still abide by the contribution limits of contributing to a Roth IRA.
I think one of the hardest things about college savings is the fact it's so challenging to know how much you need saved between, and we talked about this on episodes with Daniel Kopp and Kate Horrell, we'll link in the show notes, about college savings and working on my specific situation with my kids. I can look at calculators and the inflation of college makes it seem like I'm going to need, $15 million for each of my kids by the time they go to school, depending on which school you pick, especially if you're looking at a private 4-year school or Ivy League or something like that. And then you throw in the complications of the GI Bill. So anyway, it's very challenging to know how much money I need. And I think a lot of the people who are more skeptical of the 529s are worried about over saving for college. I would argue, however, that the average American and most of our listeners probably don't have that problem where they're going to have several $100,000 saved that they're not going to need. So again, if you're saving something, it's better than nothing. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens if you overfund and some of your options. It's not like you're going to get thrown in jail. It might hurt a little bit financially, but you have options and there's transferability and other things we'll unpack throughout the episode.
I guess maybe that's part of my skepticism there, Jamie, is anytime there's like an account that has a tax benefit for military service members with our extremely low tax rate, a lot of times there's not really an advantage there. And if you are in a higher tax bracket because you're making more income, then you don't have a problem paying for the thing. And so it's almost like the people who need this most aren't going to, like the low income people aren't going to benefit that much from a tax-free growth account, but the people who are going to most benefit from it don't really need the account anyways because they have higher income. Do you see what I mean? There's almost like a catch-22 there.
Yeah, for sure. I don't think the tax benefit comes the year that you make the contribution, though. So while I'm saving now for my 5-year-old, for example, 13 years from now, when she goes to college, my tax bracket's going to be much higher than it is now, potentially, depending on what job I do after the military. I'm very likely not going to be in the military 13 years from now. We'll see. This could be like a hashtag that didn't age well quote in a few years, but I do not expect to be in the military for 13 more years. So I don't know what my tax bracket is going to be, but I do know that the majority of my balance in my account is going to be growth, not the principal that I've invested. And so similar to my retirement savings, if I put money in and say I start as soon as we find out that the partner is expecting, or you're starting the adoption process, or you're having a grandbaby or whatever, if you start right away and let it grow for 18 years, it's going to double, ideally, depending on how you invest it, at least 2 times, maybe a little bit more than 2 times, depending on how it's invested, how risky you're willing to be. And so that tax advantage is on all that growth, not just the year.
I'll just cover one other benefit of the 529 plan in that you can designate a different beneficiary. So let's say that initially you designate nephew or a niece as the beneficiary and they end up not using all of the 529. Well, then you can designate yourself as a beneficiary. You can designate your partner or spouse as a beneficiary. You can designate your own kids as a beneficiary. And then, in fact, you can then turn control of the account over to your inheritors, and then they can designate someone else on the account. So there is a potential there that you could put money into this account, and if your children didn't end up using all of it, you could just maintain the account, continue contributing to it, or just let it grow, and then designate your grandchildren or great-grandchildren as beneficiaries of the account.
Yeah, and it's a little more flexible than that too. You can also do nieces and nephews. Say that you have $25,000 or $50,000 saved up and your kids don't use it, and then their kids don't use it, and none of your nieces or great nieces or nephews end up using the money, then your family's in such a situation where the penalty might not matter that much. But having a tax-free option for multiple generations and even nieces and nephews is pretty powerful. When we look at the qualified education expenses, and they recently expanded this, so I think this is maybe a little bit of the heartburn that some people have, but when qualified education expenses, it's not just college. So we even, at the beginning of this episode, we kind of had a misspeak of saying it's a college savings account. I think that was me. It's much more than that. You mentioned the K through 12 private tuition up to $10,000 a year, and apprenticeship programs and student loans. It even goes as far as computer equipment and internet access. So if you have a full-time student at home living with you, your $60 a month internet bill for your family is now potentially covered. Seek professional legal advice on that if you have any questions from your CPA or whatever, your EA for taxes. But I mean, I think there's a lot of options to use it where it's like, if my kid doesn't go to college, I lose my money, is not a concern with the 529.
Well, I think that is my concern, JB, is because the money is essentially trapped for educational purposes. So let's talk about what happens if you just want to pull your money out of the 529. So what happens there is you have to pay income tax on any earnings, and you also have to pay an additional 10% penalty tax on the withdrawal for non-qualified earnings. So you can get the money out. It's kind of like tapping a retirement account, like a 401k or traditional IRA or Roth IRA early, in that it's added to your income taxes, and then you have to pay a 10% penalty on top of that. And so I guess in my mind, it's like you're saving for this expense that you're not entirely sure that you're actually going to incur. With 3 children, okay, maybe you can assume that one of them is going to go to college. And so you can set aside, I don't know, a reasonable amount, $100,000 in that account. And between that and your GI Bill, like, you'll be well covered. But if the child then graduates and the money's in there growing for longer and longer, and yes, you can designate a niece or a nephew, but some people don't want to pay for their nieces or nephews' education expenses. And some people want to buy a boat, right? And you can buy a boat with the money, but you're going to have to pay income tax and a 10% penalty on top of it. Whereas if you had just put the money into a taxable brokerage account, you could have paid for the education and then the educational expense. And then when it's all done, you just can spend the money on whatever else you want. So I think because it's not a matter, in my mind, it's not a matter of saving for education or not. It's just what is the best vehicle to do it in, and the limited tax advantages of the 529 plan. It doesn't seem like the juice is worth a squeeze, I guess, is what is.
Yeah, I think there was a quote when we were texting back and forth from the initial debate where I said, it'd be silly to not put some money in a tax-free growth mechanism. I think one thing on your counter argument that I want to make sure people understand is that the penalty for not using it for qualified education expenses is regular income tax rate, which might be, say, 34% or 22% for you, not long-term capital gains, which is often something like 15%. So it could drive more taxes for you if you don't use it for qualified education expense. I can't imagine a situation where someone has overfunded their college 529 account or their 529 accounts there. I went again with college only. And they were like, man, I really wish I had some money freed up to have a boat. And they don't have other assets to be able to buy a boat. The people who are at risk of over saving have a lot of extra money, probably, where they could still afford a boat. I think that with the amount of options you have, and no one really sets out saying, I want to save so I can pay for my great niece's college or apprenticeship program. But given an opportunity to, why would you not want a mechanism that allows you to be incredibly generous potentially? If I fund this, say, the day that my first kid is born, and I can afford to put $25,000 in there, it could be several $100,000s of tax-free thing. And then my great grandkids have tax-free money to use for their education, college. Or what family has ever said, I wouldn't want a private school or a better school for my kids, whether it's like special needs or better education or like a crappy school district the military's moved you to or whatever. Like, most people aren't negative private school. They just don't want to pay for it. So what's the downside of having some money available should you get sent to, I don't want to name any cities I've been stationed in, but a few of them have been in the bottom 47, 48, and 49 of the 50 states of education. And like, I have some money to use. I'll put my kids in private school for a couple years while we're in the middle of nowhere in a terrible school district. Like, I think the trade-off is more powerful.
But I think where I'm getting hung up, though, is that's great that you want to create the Jamie funds education expenses for his kids and his great kids and his great grandkids and his niece and nephews. But what if they don't go to college? So now they completely miss out on any generosity and
private school, apprenticeship.
What if they don't?
Internet access?
What if they don't need any of that? And why would you take that opportunity away from their parents to provide for them? Why is it your choice to be generous? Like, why can't their parents be generous?
I'm not forcing them to, but I don't think anyone's ever said no thank you to a gift of like several tens of thousands of dollars. Like, if someone doesn't want the money, they can take it and then they can pay the penalty on it because I'll probably be dead by then, or they can pass it down to their niece. Like, I have a hard time imagining that between like both sides of my family, like 4 vertical columns on my family tree, like my wife's nieces, nephews on my side and my nieces and nephews on my side, that no one in 2 generations or later, as that expands, would want to go to K through 12 private school, an apprenticeship program, or college. Like, I have a really hard time believing that there's no qualified education expenses anywhere in my family tree in the future.
Could anybody tap it at any time for any qualified expense up to a limit? Or is it like a percentage base? Or like, how do you decide then, like, what? Maybe we're getting too far into like the tactics here, the weeds, but I don't know. It just seems like I understand the desire to create this like multi-generational wealth fund that like anybody in your extended family tree knows that like, hey, if you want to go to university, there's money there for you.
So that's not the goal. That's the counter argument to your point saying it's not flexible enough. My goal is to make sure my kids are funded. And if that doesn't work, then there's backup options to, I guess, refute is probably too strong a word because then it sounds like an argument, but like to counter the point that it's trapped money that you're going to have to pay a lot of taxes on to get out of there. And it's like, if you don't want to pay the taxes, just keep passing it down to cousins, generations, nieces, nephews, until someone wants to go through college, K through 12 private school, or an apprenticeship program that would fall in the qualified education expenses. But my goal is to estimate some help for my kids with GI Bill, scholarships, yellow ribbon program, all those things we talked about with Kate before, to where the tax-free money for retirement is a supplement.
How are you thinking about this? And like, was there like a target goal in mind by the time they reach like age 18, or was it just kind of contribute and then now you're seeing what's happening? And yeah, so let's talk about how much you've invested and then how you're investing it.
So I started saving 529 accounts for my first oldest kid, who's 13 now, when I think right after he was born. And I think I was doing like maybe $25 or $50 a month into maybe even a USA 529 plan at the time, and barely had any money by the time I really knew what to do with it. And I can't find easily how much money I've put into it over the years, but right now my 13-year-old has about $46,000 invested in the 529. My 9-year-old has about $41,000, and my 5-year-old has $33,000 saved. In those three 529 accounts, I have almost 150, a little less than 150 grand in there for college, plus a GI Bill.
I was going to say another good point to raise here, though, Jamie, is like, let's say your oldest doesn't use all of his 529. You can then just roll it over to the next one and start merging the accounts. And in fact, at the end up with just one giant super account. That's another kind of flexibility argument there. You can open separate accounts for everyone, or you could just open one account and just keep changing the beneficiary every time you need to.
Yeah. So when I switched to Vanguard 529s a few years back, I have my 529s invested basically the same way that I invest in my philosophy, which is like VTSAX, total stock market, or S&P 500 type index funds. And it performs just like the stock market does. And so they're depending on how my financial situation is and what my cash flow is like, I might need to become more conservative as my first child gets closer to college age. But right now I intend to keep it relatively aggressive on the growth because I have other tools available. And also, I haven't mentioned this yet, but another option I have is if a kid gets a scholarship, you're able to withdraw the amount of the scholarship out penalty free as well. So say if one kid gets into the service academy, whatever the value of that is, probably like $100,000 total over 4 years, I'm guessing. I don't know how they value that. Kate would probably know, but.
So service academy, you can clear the whole thing out.
The whole account?
I believe so. Yeah, I'll double check that now that I've said it. But service academy, you're allowed to withdraw the entire 529, I believe. And then for other scholarships, it's like an ROTC scholarship, for example, it would just be the dollar amount of the ROTC scholarship.
Yeah, you get a $10,000 scholarship from the school, $10,000 scholarship from ROTC, and then you can take $20,000 out, and that's of your gains because your contributions are already after tax. So you get some of that gains that can come out without the taxes. So what I'm looking at as my money is, one, I'm going to hire Kate or some other coach to work with me when it comes time to actually come up with a plan. But I think that depending on where the kids go to school, we have enough money to start the process. And 5 years from now, when my first kid is ready for college, we have about $150,000 saved right now, and it won't quite double again, but maybe it'll be around 200 or 225-ish. We should be okay, I think, for college. And so what I did this year is I basically stopped. I'm putting in $50 a month for my oldest kid only, and I've stopped contributing for my youngest two because their time horizon is so far out where their money will double again. And so they'll each have at least $100,000 in their account. And again, I can move it between people. I can change beneficiaries. If I choose to go back to school for a doctorate degree or whatever, I can make it my beneficiary. So that's kind of where I'm at, and just full transparency on my actual accounts right now.
Yeah, see, I guess the way that you've structured that, Jamie, that makes sense to me, where once you realize that you're going to have an abundance in the account, like you just progged out, like this is going to double at least one more time, probably two times by the time they get to university. I think that's, you've recognized like, okay, we're like, even if college, tuition doubles again in the next couple of years, like there's going to be some money there for it. And we'll be able to make up the difference in other ways, whether it's, scholarship or GI Bill, like you said. Just a quick note from one of our sponsors, and then we'll be right back to the show.
Hey, Spencer, I got a cousin that just graduated from high school, and they're about to start basic training in a few months. Any ideas on a gift I should get them?
Yep, sure do, Jamie. The Military Money Manual, A Practical Guide to Financial Freedom, is a concise, easy to read, and practical guide to your military money. It's the book that I wish someone had handed me on my first day in the military. In the book, I explain the exact money tactics and investing strategies that can enable you to achieve financial independence while serving in the U.S. military. It's available on Amazon, Audible, and my website. It's hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle, and audiobook. You can get a special discount using promo code podcast on my website, shop.militarymoneymanual.com.
So Spencer, here's a question for you that the listener might be wondering is, where do they actually do this? Where does this come in their order? If they're still getting out of debt, do they need to start a 529 plan today?
I would say this is kind of one of those end game situations where you got to put on your own oxygen mask first before helping others. So if you're in debt, don't be messing around with a 529 plan. If you're not maxing out your retirement and savings accounts, I mean, it's hard to argue, especially for lower income military service members. Like, there are ways that you can max your Roth IRA and your Roth TSP. It's just extremely difficult for most families. I mean, if you're a single guy or gal and you're deployed and you're just like, all right, yeah, I could do it this year. Like, I make $50,000. I'll throw $30,000 into my retirement accounts. Awesome. But for, especially, if you've got a partner and they're staying at home with the kids and you got 2 kids, that's a lot harder lift there. So I would say a 529 is one of those things that it's towards the end game. Like, you would be probably debt-free, or at least have a really good debt-free freedom plan. You're maxing out your Roth IRA. You're contributing to your Roth TSP at least the 5% to get the match. And are you hitting your savings goals to reach financial independence? Because it's going to be a lot easier to help your kids go to college if you're not sweating that you still have to work to earn the right to exist, earn the right to eat. So I think that's kind of where my head is at, Jamie, with the 529. I know you started yours a little bit earlier. Like, you probably weren't maxing out your retirement accounts when you were contributing to a 529. I was not. No. Yeah. And I understand the pull for a parent to want to make sure that their kid is taken care of. But, what I think it's Rob Shea likes to say, like, you can borrow for college, you can't borrow for your retirement. So if you absolutely have to, and I mean, I did it, right? I graduated university with an ROTC scholarship. I still had $60,000 of student loan debt. And I guess that's another argument. Another interesting thing, Jamie, is how much more invested was I in becoming financially independent and becoming debt-free because I had the student loan debt. There's always that question of like, well, if my parents had just set me up in such a way that I'd graduated debt-free, think of how much further I could be ahead financially. But would I be? Would there have been that drive and that motivation, that fire to become financially independent and retire early if I hadn't had that experience of carrying around debt and recognizing how much it sucked and how much I wanted to pay it off as fast as possible?
I see your point. I think it'd be short-sighted in some ways, though, to not help out people to like teach them a lesson, because they might learn the lesson another way.
I don't see it as teaching them a lesson. I just see it as like, if you're not financially independent yet, and it means you're going to have to work for another 10 years so that your kid can go to college and graduate debt-free, but they can borrow, money at a reasonable interest rate to go to university. Yeah, I don't know. There's something there about like every generation keeps sacrificing for the next generation. And it's like, well, what point is the party? Like, when are we going to stop sacrificing and start living? And now you're a great example of someone who's like got ahead of this, right? So like, you're not going to be sacrificing. Like, you're going to be well in your path to financial independence and be able to cover your kids. So you've got that abundance there. But for some families, it might be tough, and they might not have the child might be 15, 16 years old before they're like, oh my gosh, like, we haven't saved for our own retirement, and now we've got this little munchkin who wants to go to college. I could just see that as a tough situation to be. I guess that's getting away from the 529 discussion. That's getting more philosophical about like, what is your role as a parent to provide resources for your children to be successful? And I mean, maybe it comes back to like the Warren Buffett quote, like, I want to give them enough that they can do anything, but not so much that they can't do nothing.
Yeah, we probably should have caveated that at the beginning, that this is if you want to help and you're in the situation to help, but you definitely need to take care of your own self and your retirement. I would like to think that most of our listeners get encouraged enough where they come up with a plan where hopefully they're not having to do student loans for their kids, or they have other options, depending on where they at and how close they are to college in their own journey. Definitely, if you're further out, like, don't rely on the student loans. But could you imagine just the option to be able to wipe out your niece's student loans or your great grandkids' student loans? Maybe they don't know that you have it, and you do that as a wedding present. And I think, as we talked about generosity before, the earlier you can be generous with someone, it impacts their life much more. Giving them an inheritance at 60 or 70 when you die at 90 is not as helpful as buying someone's house or helping them put it down a good down payment for their first house when they're 25 years old, or when they're 40 years old doing an epic vacation for the family or something like that. So there's a balance here. It's very personal. Each family is going to have to figure out exactly what they want to do. But if you want to help out, I think the 529 college savings plan that isn't just for college is a great potential mechanism for you to at least consider. And I know you have a list of, your skeptic topics we've kind of scattered throughout, but are there any other summary points on the con side that you want to hit?
Yeah, I guess, in the end, it's taking a balanced approach, if you're maxing out your Roth IRA, you're maxing out your Roth TSP, you're putting money into a taxable brokerage account, and you're excited, you're welcoming that newborn into the world, and you're like, what's this whole 529 thing? And you start putting some money into there. And after a couple of years, you realize, like, oops, I put too much money into there, and it's going to grow to be, $500,000 by the time they get to college. And even if they go to a 4-year private university and then they go get a master's degree, like, there's just no way they're going to spend all that money. There's still outs, right? Like, we talked about the IRA transfer. We talked about changing the beneficiary's name. And at the end of the day, if you really screwed up and you put $1 million in there and it doesn't look like there's going to be future generations to pass it on to, then you just pulled out, you pay the income tax, you pay the 10%, and you're done. It's not like the money is just gone. I just have this drive for simplicity. And one thing I really hate is restrictions. Yep. But also I hate controlling from beyond the grave. If I set up any kind of legacy account for my heirs, it's just going to go to them. They're just going to receive the money. And hopefully I have given them enough instruction and enough training that they know what to do with it. I can entrust them with this gift. They can recognize, like, oh, I can use this money for college, or I can use this money for K through 12 education. I guess that's what I like is, and they can decide, do I use this for a house down payment? Do I use this for education? But they get to choose, and it's not this magic account that's locked into only education expenses, because, like, maybe that's just not as important to you, or maybe it is important to you, but you pay for it in other ways. And you're like, I got this covered. But I just need some money for a down payment for my house, and I can't access it without paying taxes and 10% penalty. And I don't know. I like giving people options in the future. So I think I get my hackles up a little bit when I see the restrictions, and I like to have maximum freedom and flexibility in my accounts. But I'm skeptical of the actual dollar value of the 529 tax-free growth when typically it's only growing for 20 years. I can see the advantages of creating I have heard of people creating, they call them Dynasty 529 for multi-generational educational funding. And you have, one benefactor who's super funded it over many decades. And now, in the entire extended family tree, they know that, hey, you get X percentage of the fund and it's multi-million dollars. And so, essentially any education expense you want to pay for is covered. That's a beautiful thing. But again, I am skeptical of the restrictions on the fund and how long that can be maintained before someone gets control of the fund and either clears it out or just doesn't understand, what it's meant to be used for. And, what do they say? Shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. Like, the first generation makes it, the second generation maintains it, and the third generation squanders it or something. So I'm skeptical of how long these multi-generational 529s can actually last.
See, I think you're getting hung up a little bit on the multi-generational aspect of it. That's not the intent of it. It's a backup option if you don't use it. And I think in a situation with 3 kids, chances are very good that at least one of my kids is going to have some kind of qualified education expenses between private school, apprenticeship, community college, regular college. And I'm not talking about the 529 prepaid tuition thing. I don't like that plan. We mentioned that in the episode with Kate Horrell. about the different types of 529s. This is purely the college savings program that's not just for college. And then, on the practical aspect of it, when you're looking at defining appropriate funding levels, I think I would encourage you to at least look at the absolute cheapest community college in your area or where you think you might retire after the military or whatever. And maybe it's only $25,000 or $50,000 for an entire 4-year or 2-year degree. Then maybe make that your target, where maybe you put in $1,000 twice and then you let it grow from there, and you don't have to worry about overfunding. So all the multi-generational thing is only if you grossly miscalculate or you grossly underestimate your education goals of your family or your nieces, nephews, or your grandkids. But like the primary purpose is to take care of your kids, and then you have options in the backup. Some other practical considerations is make sure that if you're going to be interested in it at all, and you like the idea of having that $35,000 Roth IRA option rollover that Spencer mentioned spread out over a couple of years, the account has to be open for 15 years. So I recommend starting a 529 account when the child is young, and maybe just throw a little bit in there just in case, maybe only a couple $100 until you're in a more solid financial situation or you understand exactly what you want to do with that money. But because that account is open, then you can then roll it over and have that option when you meet all the other criteria. But you can't wait till they're 18 and they decide not to go to college and then roll all that over to a Roth IRA if it's only a couple years old. So that's another restriction to watch out for.
Well, Jamie, thank you so much for letting me think out loud about this. I can definitely see the value, especially for a family with several children. There's a high probability, many Americans, especially military family, military service members, children are going to be going to university or have other qualified education expenses, right? It's not just for university. And there are some exit strategies. So, I don't think it'll hurt most families with children who plan to go to university. I can see that there is some benefit to putting
in the right order, though.
But in the right order, I think that's key. Yeah, I think people need to make sure that they're looking after themselves so that they don't have to rely on their children when they're in retirement. And hopefully, you are taking care of your own financial independence so that your children don't have to achieve financial independence for themselves and then keep working to support you. But I think the 529, though, could definitely have its place in someone's strategy. I keep getting hung up on the restrictions, though, Jamie, and
you just don't like people telling you what to do.
I think that's it. I think I have a strong bias to freedom, as every good American does. So
I think the last quote I want to leave from our text debate when this first started was a perspective of it's like a tax smart gift card for education with an exit plan. So if you value education of any time and not just college, people buy Microsoft gift cards or Amazon gift cards for graduation gifts all the time. I just had one niece and one nephew graduate from high school this year, and gifts are expensive. And if there's a way to do that tax-free, then maybe it's something to consider, or the growth tax-free, I should clarify.
Yep, that's great. Yeah, let us know in the comments. Shoot us a DM at Military Money Manual on Instagram. Podcast at militarymoneymanual.com is our email. You can leave a comment on Spotify. That's a cool new feature. Just got another notification today. We've got a couple comments on our podcast episodes on Spotify. So that's a really easy way to reach out and chat with us. And Jamie, we've got a 100% hit rate on responding to all of those. So yeah, reach out. Let us know what your strategy is. Let us know if we missed something. Maybe I'm just hung up on the flexibility thing, but I'm just missing a broader point that kind of makes that whole argument moot. And I'd love to hear about it. I'll admit I'm not an expert on the 529 stuff, but I think you got to get your financial house in order, have a debt repayment plan, be contributing to your Roth IRA, be contributing to your Roth TSP, getting your BRS blended retirement system, 5% match. And then if you know that some education expenses are going to be in your future, there is a tax advantage savings vehicle that the U.S. government provides through the 529 plan. Jamie, you've got yours at Vanguard, which you recommend if people need just a general 529 plan that without any state benefits?
I do. I like the simplicity of it because all of my investment accounts are there. So that's a big win, is just one login. It makes it easy. I know the funds. I know the tickers that I like to invest in, so I don't have to worry about all of that, and I can control it. Some of the state funds you can't control. This is their option. It automatically goes more conservative as the kid gets closer to college age. So you may or may not want that control, but I like being able to say I want VTI and I want 100% or whatever the mix is. The fees are a little bit higher. I want to say it's like 0.6%, if I remember correctly, than what I traditionally get with a low-cost index fund like we normally recommend. So that is another con of it. But I think all 529 accounts will have a higher fee than your normal brokerage account will. So it's still not terribly high. But.
Great stuff. All right. Well, hit us up. Instagram. Leave a 5-star review if you got some value out of the podcast. We'll catch you on the next episode.
Thanks so much for tuning in to this episode of the Military Money Manual podcast. If you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This helps others find the show, and we really appreciate it. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.
The views and opinions presented here are those of the speakers and do not necessarily represent the views of the DoD or its components. Reference to any commercial products or services does not constitute DoD endorsement of those products or services.